Hello, welcome to the first episode of John's Shower Thoughts. So originally this segment was going to be John's shower comedy. However, there are days that I don't feel like being funny. So today's one of them, and basically today we're going to talk about guns. Why am I doing this in the shower anyway?
Are you live?
Huh?
Are you live?
No, I'm not that brave. She asked me if I'm live. I said, no, I'm not that brave. So, every single time, every couple weeks now, I guess, we have this discussion about guns in America. There's a couple things here that are important to understand historically. Historically, our nation, the nation we live in, America, was founded, on the idea that humans have individual liberty. Now, that means that the government is restricted in how it approaches individual human beings. That the government should be restricted in what it can do legally to individual human beings. So, we had colonies here. We came to this continent and we established colonies. We started taking over. The colonies were sponsored by either countries, nations, or they were sponsored by commercial interests. Literally, we came to this country to take as much of the resources out of this country, See, it wasn't even a country. It was a landmass, right? There were people here before we got here. People that were living their lives and they were hunting, they were gathering, there was actual farming, there was cultivation, there were actual societies, there were rules, there were laws, there were wars, there was peace. And the European colonists arrived and the European explorers arrived and they started taking over because at that time we had superior technology, we had superior methods, and the people here, in a lot of ways, were more primitive than the people that were coming in to take it over. So basically, we ended up establishing a very strong foothold on this continent, but as far as Great Britain was concerned, Great Britain was, at that time, at least in the Western world, known as the most powerful empire. They had the widest reach, the longest reach. They had the most powerful navy. They had the most powerful armies. And there came a time when they had the most colonies, the most established colonies, and what we would call states now, and infrastructure, literal infrastructure up and down the Atlantic seaboard. So the home country, England, the ruler of Great Britain being all the other countries that England was the ruler of, there came a time when the colonists came into conflict with the rules imposed by Great Britain, when they chafed against that, and they said, look, we've been here long enough, we've basically established a nation here, but yet we're still being oppressed in certain ways by the British, and we don't have a voice in Parliament, we don't have any representation there, but yet we're being taxed as if we do. So whereas in England, actually, they had a parliament. The king was not actually all-powerful in England because of things that had happened hundreds of years previously where the nobles had stood up and said, hey, you can't treat us this way. Now, keep in mind that all these human rights that they speak of and everything didn't extend all the way down to the peasant class. Right? It didn't extend all the way down actually to every individual. Even if some of those some of the rights that were attributed, were said to extend all the way down. In the nitty-gritty of it, there were often exceptions. So anyway, the American Revolution comes about because the actual Parliament in Great Britain, along with the King, have decided that they are going to tax the Americas, tax the people here, without any vote or any representation or any chance to even argue against these taxes in Parliament. And they felt that this was oppressive. Now, in order to quell this sentiment of not wanting to be taxed, the thinkers in America, in the American colonies, started intellectually rebelling. They started publishing papers and pamphlets, and sometimes anonymously, sometimes under their own names, to foment the idea, to instill the idea that we should be an independent nation, independent of Great Britain. If Great Britain won't give us representation, then we should be an independent nation. Now, Great Britain doesn't want to go to war, so they would come in and they would actually confiscate the guns. They confiscated the civilian stores of guns to try to prevent war, to try to prevent access to firearms, which, of course, could be used against Great Britain. Along with this, they did other things, like they would quarter soldiers in private homes. They would basically take over people's private homes, essentially making servants out of the people who owned those homes, who themselves had servants. So now their servants aren't even their own servants anymore. And what this does is it causes the people in the Americas to feel even more infringed upon, even more willing to go to war. But not everybody. There were a lot of people here who were like, look, we got to listen to the mother country here. They put us here. They know what's best. Our lives are okay. So there were a lot of people here called loyalists. So it wasn't like everybody in the Americas wanted to go to war against Great Britain. But, let's get back to the guns part of it. The fact is, though, is that Great Britain did harangue the civilian population. They oppressed the civilian population, especially on the part of guns, and tried to take away the guns. They did take away a lot of the guns, and then, the American colonists obviously were able to get more guns or make more guns. They were also, when it came to wartime, they were able to steal guns back and steal guns from the British. And then along with a lot of help from other countries, we were eventually able to force the British to capitulate, to give up. And we won the war. We won our independence. So that means that not we won, right? So the colonists in America were jubilant. And it means that we had a lot of people in this nation, this new nation, who were justifiably proud of winning their independence, and who also didn't want to see anything like that happen again, because they figured, if we are now going to form our own government, we're going to govern ourselves for the first time in history, for Anglo-Saxon people. We're not going to be beholden to lords. We're not going to be beholden to corporations. We're certainly not going to be beholden to anybody calling themselves a monarch. Because of that, those people, their thoughts, their ideals, their characteristics have been passed on to subsequent generations of people here. We have a fierce independent streak, and we are, rightfully proud of our history of winning independence against what was arguably the largest military force in the world at the time, and a force that was backed by probably pretty much the most money at the time. Now, having said that, England was also hated by many of its neighboring European countries because of their size and their force and their reach. So, there was a lot of nations, France, Netherlands, other countries, that wanted to see England taken down several notches, and reduced to a sense of parity, so that they didn't feel like that they were a target of the English, penchant for acquisition. They also didn't want to be fighting with England in other parts of the world and have to relinquish their colonies that they had established in other parts of the world. So, there's a lot of complexity involved there. But how we get from there to here is basically the independent streak characteristic that allowed us as a people, allowed the people back then as a people, enough of them to stand up and say, we're going to fight for this. This might be a suicide mission, but we're going to fight for this because we believe in it so strongly that we should be able to govern ourselves. And those characteristics have survived, good, rightfully so, and they course through the veins of many, many, many American citizens. And that means, American citizens of all kinds. It's not just white European guys, not guys that look like me. There's a lot of people in this country who rightfully would have a beef with this country, because when their ancestors got here, they were treated like shit. But through subsequent generations, they have come up to be also proud of what the Revolutionary Army accomplished in this country. They are on board with the idea of a people creating their own government, a government that is drawn from the people, of the people, for the people, and by the people. You can say that in any order, but it works. Now, the problem with that is, of course, is that when we elect representatives to send them off to somewhere to debate and make laws, we have this sense that they are actually representing what each individual wants, and there's a push and pull between factions about, so some people say, well, the government, should do this for the people, and the other faction says, no, the government shouldn't do that for the people. And one faction says the government, should be able to do this to the people, right? And the other faction says, no, the government should never be able to do that to the people. So that sets up an endless debate, endless push and pull, which is actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, because when we have ideas about how things should be run, right? You either have dictatorships where one person is fully in charge. They can take in whatever input they want. They can disregard it. They can take in no input if they want. And however they have accumulated power, they do have that power. And when they issue an order, it gets carried out. So if anybody disagrees with that order, they either keep silent, or if they speak up, they run the risk of being removed or killed, or taken out of the loop of power, so to speak, right? And that can run fairly well if you have a dictator who's wise and is able to make good decisions, and the people are happy, and the economy's going and everything, and people live under dictatorships. People live happy, full, productive lives under some dictatorships, and then in other dictatorships, some of the people are living well and a lot of the people are not living well, and anyone who dissents is living even worse. So that's, that's one form of government. And now if you have a form of self-government like we do, you have to choose amongst the people and say, who do we feel should be making laws? And people have to make their pitch, it's a job interview basically. The problem comes in is when anybody gets in between the people, that's us, and the lawmaker that we elected, because the lawmaker they don't get to go make laws unless we elect them. But the problem is that those lawmakers can be heavily influenced by people who don't have a vote, or by entities that don't have a vote, okay? So when we create a lobbying group, for example, like the NRA, the National Rifle Association, or a lobbying group like the American Civil Liberties Union, right? So there's two groups right there that seem like they're opposed. The American Civil Liberties Union is all about protecting First Amendment rights of free expression, right? And making sure that Americans are, in addition to, they actually cover more than that in the Bill of Rights, but generally they're not known as they're generally known as more of a left-leaning, liberal, progressive group, and they use their power to lobby for laws that they feel. They use their power to lobby lawmakers for changes to the laws that favor individual rights of free expression and equal treatment under the law. Basically, the ideal that every person is born equal and should be treated equally, okay, under the law. And then a group like the NRA, the National Rifle Association, they lobby for no restrictions on the ownership of arms, primarily firearms. Now, obviously, that brings us to the point of whether any right is absolute or not. So when somebody says, the right to bear arms, right? The right to keep and bear arms, which basically means the right to own arms and the right to actually wear them, to keep them about your person, to have it on your body or in your car or near you or accessible, easily accessible to you. Is that right supposed to be? Can it ever be an absolute right? So a person is born and they have the right to keep and bear arms, Now, going back to the First Amendment, right? The right of expression, the First Amendment actually is there to prohibit the government. And basically most of the amendments are there to prohibit the government from doing things to individuals without certain guidelines, without following certain guidelines. So you go to the First Amendment and you say, well, does a person have the right to say anything they want? And the answer to that is no, they don't. And the answer to the gun issue is no, people cannot have the right to keep and bear arms absolutely with zero restrictions. Think of a 5-year-old, right? We have decided a 5-year-old is a human being, right? So the Constitution doesn't make a distinction between a 5-year-old and a 25-year-old. So the government has made restrictions, though, that people, rightfully so, look at and say, we all agree that a 5-year-old shouldn't be allowed to walk into a gun store and purchase a gun and be able then theoretically to walk out and use it, right? Now, we teach 5-year-olds how to use guns, so in most states it's not illegal for 5-year-olds to be able to handle a gun, to fire a gun under supervision, right? We have videos online of people doing just that. But we realize that 5-year-olds generally do not have the mental capacity to make properly informed, rational decisions on when to use the firearms. Now, we can argue that there are well-trained 5-year-olds out there who do know very clearly when to use a firearm, and more importantly, how to use a firearm. And we can argue that most of these kids are probably well adjusted and trusted by their parents or their guardians or whoever is teaching them gun safety. And statistically, these children are probably very unlikely to use a gun in a tragic way, out of anger or out of carelessness, and cause injury there. So we're clear about that, right? I mean, that's something that we've come to understand as a way that our society has developed. Even saying that, though, there's no card that a 5-year-old can earn where they can then walk into a gun shop alone and purchase a firearm. Okay? That's not going to happen in our country. I think even the most, I would say that the very most ardent supporters of the Second Amendment being an absolute right would say, sure, a 5-year-old should be able to walk in and get a gun, especially if they've already passed a gun safety, they're signed off on, there's people who know that they're able to handle a gun. They would probably say, yes, that's fine, right? But the vast majority of Americans, including the vast majority of gun owners, probably say that that's not a good idea and that's not going to be allowed, Now, if a parent or a guardian goes in and they, they're the ones making the actual purchase and they're asking their 5-year-old, hey, is this what you want, right? Then that's pretty much perfectly legal all over the country. Unless it's, unless there's some prohibition against buying guns for minors, specifically. But anyway, that's part of the debate, right? Because that right there shows you that there's not enough Americans who think that the right to own guns is so absolute that it extends to every age group. So by that token, right, we've also established that certain other groups can't own guns. Felons are not allowed to own guns. That's a national law. That runs completely counter to the idea that the Second Amendment is absolute. Because if a person has committed a crime, they've gone to jail, they've been punished for it, they've paid their debt to society, so to speak, right? Then infringing on their rights, their further rights, can be seen as a form, for the rest of their natural lives, can be seen as as cruel and unusual punishment. It can be seen as effectively punishing a person for their crime for their entire life. Now, should we have that or should we not have that? That's again another debate. But it goes to show that the right is not absolute. Right? It means that we have accepted that there are reasons why, as a society, we can accept an infringement of the right to own, to keep and bear arms on individuals in certain circumstances. And we accept that. So the debate really is, who gets to own guns? That's where the line is right now, Who gets to own guns and who gets to decide who gets to own guns? Now we get into something, that if you have ever watched the movie Minority Report or read the book, you will understand that this is something that they had in there called thought crime or pre-crime, right? Because they had in that movie, they had empaths or telepaths who could tune in to the thoughts of people in the public, and when people had anger and rising thoughts and thoughts of committing a crime against someone else that would harm them, and I believe in there that they specifically, had murder. If you had thoughts of murder, that could be picked up by the empaths, and literally people could go and be charged. They could be arrested, charged, and imprisoned for life for having those thoughts. So they didn't actually commit any crime, but the propensity to commit crime was what landed them in prison for life. So their life was effectively over at that point. So that is something that people fear. You know, they're like, okay, who gets to decide that I might commit a crime and therefore you can infringe on my rights. You can sever my ability to have a fundamental right that is outlined in the Constitution of the United States. Who gets to decide that? And that's a very weighty subject. You know, we talk about this all the time, and unfortunately, in America, we are extremely reactive to things because we wait until something happens and then we try to discuss how to figure it out and try to figure out, you know, where are the slippery slopes here? How much liberty do we give up to gain some security? So Benjamin Franklin famously said, anyone who gives up a little bit of liberty for a little bit of security deserves neither. Now, I think that statement, as much as I like Ben Franklin and a lot of the things that he said and did, I think that statement is it's too cliche. It sounds good. It's a good soundbite, but in reality, it really negates all the complexities that are available in this argument. Now, we want, as a society, we want to have easy answers. You know, we like slogans, and we like complex thoughts to be encapsulated into easy to understand slogans, easy to remember slogans. You know, give me liberty or give me death, don't tread on me, stuff like that. You know, I mean, these are enduring marketing slogans, if you will, that encapsulate a very complex set of thoughts and concerns for the people, right? United we stand, divided we fall, and so on, right? Well, the fact of it is, though, is that even back in the Revolutionary War, as I told you, there was a lot of people. They came to be called loyalists because they were loyal to the British Crown. They didn't want separation. And then we had revolutionaries who thought that the time of diplomacy had passed, that they had tried every diplomatic means to get the British Crown to listen to them. And so now the time was there for separation. But what it meant for the colonies is we actually had a divided population. You know, we had people that were loyal to the crown, that were willing to help the crown to keep the relationship the same, the way it was. And then we had people who wanted to break completely, make up our own government. So you can see that something like united we stand, divided we fall, doesn't always apply, right? So of course a group is going to apply that to themselves, and they're going to say, like if you're the NRA, you'll say, united we stand, divided we lose our rights to own guns, right? If you're the ACLU, right, you say, united we stand on civil rights, divided we lose our access to civil rights. Now, civil rights applies to everyone, right? So people think that the ACLU is only there to protect the rights of minorities. That's not true. The ACLU is there to protect the rights of all people who stand in the way of the government. They're there to protect the ACLU has protected the right, not protected, but the ACLU has fought for the right of free speech for Ku Klux Klan members, for example, you know? The ACLU has fought for the civil liberties of black people. They fought for the right to end segregation, the very thing that the Ku Klux Klan wanted to continue. They wanted segregation to continue. But the ACLU fights for the right of the Klansmen to stand up and say, I think that, or the Klan to say they think that there should be no integration, that white people should have whites only restaurants and black people can have blacks only restaurants. And the hardest of the heart of them say that they go even further and say whites shouldn't even be allowed to go into black owned or black only businesses, for example. And, you know, having said that, there are also black people who feel that way. There are black people who feel like we should be able to have black-only clubs where white people are excluded from here. They can't come in. So there are black racists, there are Latino racists, there are white racists. And the ACLU stands up for the right of all of those people to speak their views. And share their opinions on that, you know, as abhorrent as as a lot of us might think they are. The NRA, for example, stands up for the right of any Americans to own guns. Now, sometimes their rhetoric, you know, sometimes the rhetoric of people who claim to be NRA members feels like that they're only speaking about the majority of white people, for example. But that's absolutely not true. For example, the NRA actually has a lot of minority members. Minority, by minority, I mean non-white members. They have a lot of adherents. They have a lot of former gun control advocates who actually formerly were closer to the ban all guns stance, who then moved over to adopt the NRA stance of basically, as much as possible, no infringement on the ownership of guns. So you can see that it's a very complex topic, and people's minds can change. People can go from one direction to the other. There's military veterans who stand up and say, look, I'm a military veteran, I use the M16, you know, a lot of them were in Vietnam, places like that, and they're like, there's just no real reason that they say that a normal average American person needs these guns. These are military people who swore an oath to defend the Constitution. And there's other military veterans who say every American should have the guns. They should have plenty of guns. That way criminals will be deterred, or deranged people will be deterred from committing gun violence when they think that every person has a gun. Reportedly, one of the Japanese generals back in World War II said they can't invade America because in America, behind every blade of grass is a gun, is someone with a gun. And you know, there's on the surface of it, there's merit to that thinking, right? Again, we get back to the simplistic thinking about it, where you think if your entire population is going to be able to rise up against you as an invader, it makes it that much harder to control the population. And therefore, if you know that the majority of the population does not have guns and they don't have easy access to guns, then it makes it that much easier to go in and invade. So there's logic to that, okay? But here's what it comes down to for me. For me, it comes down to this. We have to have a balance between access to killing machinery, right? And when I say machinery, I specifically mean firearms, right? Because firearms give easy access to a device that allows people to kill at distance. Okay? So if you think about other things like a car, for example, right? A car you can run into a crowd. Yes, you can. But you don't really have, you know, as much control over who gets killed and when they get killed or how they get killed, right? You have other means, bombs, you know, things like that. Most people aren't going to go through the trouble to learn how to make a bomb or learn how to acquire a bomb. You can't walk into a Dick's Sporting Goods or somewhere like that and buy a bomb, right? You can't easily buy dynamite. You can't easily buy nitroglycerin and that sort of thing, right? At least as far as I know, you can't, right? So these are not the things that the average person would find easy to acquire. I'm not saying they can't be acquired. I'm not saying they can't be built. Of course, there's plans on the internet about how to make bombs, how to make Molotov cocktails, that sort of thing. Obviously, people have committed terrorist acts with household items, pressure cookers filled with screws, and nails, right? Famously, the Boston bombing, that's what the deal was there. So it's not to say that these things can't be made. They can be. Obviously, they have been made. It's just that they're not as easy. They're not nearly as easy to do and to deal with as acquiring guns. So that's one thing to consider. And then the other thing to consider is our mental health as a society, right? We're all individuals. We're all absolutely unique combinations of DNA, evolution, and environment, right? We're all absolutely unique in that sense. There are no two human beings that are identical in mind and body, right? Even identical twins are not, right? Because identical twins are going to fork and have different experiences at some point, right? So at the beginning of their lives, they're treated the same. Their diapers are changed by the same person. They're cared for in the same way. They get fed at the same time and so on. But eventually their lives begin to fork and they start to have different experiences. So even though that they are genetically identical, they are not identical mentally. So there's going to be differences. So now you ask yourself, okay, when the society grows so large, right? When we have not millions of people, but tens of millions, 50 million, 100 million, 300 million, a billion people, right? A billion individuals. Then you ask yourself, how are these individuals able to get along with each other, with themselves even? What's going on in their minds? That's something that we have to consider as a society, because you can't just take it for granted. You can't take it for granted that individuals growing up in such a large and complex society are able to have a rational and similar set of decision-making capabilities. You can't assume that every individual is a peaceful person by nature and they're generally good inside, what we call good. See, that's a whole other issue about what is good and what is not good. So I don't want to go into the depth of that right now. I'm just going into, we as a society need to care about what's going on with individuals. Not that we want to make everyone plain vanilla, and make sure that on every test, for example, people always mark off the same boxes about how they would act and react to different situations. That's not what we're going for, but we are going for a sense that if there's a line between how to handle conflict, and that line is think about it, figure out the most peaceful way to resolve the conflict within yourself and with others that are involved in the conflict, and using violence to address the conflict. What we would want is, we want the vast majority of people, and a greater number than we currently have, to choose the peaceful path, to choose the rational, peaceful path to resolving the conflict, wherever possible. Okay? Wherever possible. So obviously there's going to be conflict where people are physically attacking, and that conflict can't be resolved with peace. It has to be resolved with force. to stop a person from creating harm against others. But we want to reduce that as much as possible, that people feel that that's what they need to do to force others to do what they want, to listen to them, to highlight whatever their issue is, whatever their feelings are, whatever their social anxiety is. We want to reduce that as much as possible. Now, how do we do that, right? How do we do that? Well, one thing in my mind that we can do is simply institute universal health care. That doesn't mean everybody gets the exact same health care, but it means everyone has access to health care. Everyone who needs it. That we take mental trauma and we destigmatize it. We stop making fun of crazy people, because, and of course we're still going to make jokes and make fun and everything like that. I mean, we have to have humor in our lives. We have to be able to process trauma and stress and so on. But when people are really hurting inside, when they're not fitting into society for some reason, when they're feeling bullied, or they're feeling lost, or they're feeling worthless, or they're feeling super depressed, we have to make it so freakingly easy for those people to put their hands up and say, hey, help me. I need some help here. Let's talk this out. Let's figure this out. Without having to jump through hoops. Without having to worry about how they're going to pay for it. Without having to worry about what their friends are going to think about them and so on, right? We have to do that as a society, because that's how we reduce the number of people who feel like that some major violent act is all that's left for them. That's all they can do. Now, I'm going to tell you my personal story. I grew up with a lot of anger. I have destroyed doors. I've destroyed walls. I've run my car into things. I had so much rage inside of me as a child. Not as a child, but kind of as a teenager growing up. My personal story was we moved around a lot, very traumatically. My mother would come home and she'd say, pack a bag, we're leaving. And then that was literally it. Like, from one moment to the next, we're literally driving to another state with nothing. With what I could grab. I could grab some books, I could grab some clothes, but whatever I had that was mine, outside of whatever the few things that I could grab, was just left there. So whatever was meaningful to me, whether it's possessions or friendships that I had started, just gone. Instantly gone as a child. And this happened over and over and over. And then when we didn't leave, before we left, there was trauma too. My mother bashed her boyfriend's head in one time with a cast iron skillet. She didn't kill him, but he went to the hospital. She went to jail. My mother went to jail for drug issues and other issues. She went to prison. I went to live with my grandmother, who was worse. My grandmother beat us with a bullwhip, or she beat me with a bullwhip. And maybe that's what my mother went through, or maybe my grandmother was just angry about having 2 kids dumped on her. Whatever. The fact is that my story, unfortunately, is not uncommon in America. It's not uncommon around the world. We can read stories about abuse. You can read, like, Oliver Twist is not fiction. It's fiction based on unfortunate reality. And for those of you who don't know what Oliver Twist is, Oliver Twist was a story about orphans or street kids taken in by an evil kind of adult mastermind, who he liked the kids because they could crawl through the windows and unlock the doors from the inside so that they could come in and burglarize the houses and so on. And Oliver Twist actually had unbelievably a better life doing that than he did in the orphanages back then, if I'm remembering the story right. I could be misremembering it. Than he had in the orphanage, which really was super oppressive to the kids that were dumped off at the orphanage. So, we have a history in our society of just unrelenting trauma being heaped on children. And unfortunately, in the American society, we don't have good, easy access to health care and mental health care. So therefore, we have, millions of people walking around with unresolved trauma, who are angry and bitter and upset for God knows how many reasons, how much stimulus. Now people will say video games, for example, violent video games do it. That's what they've said. They say endless violence on television numbs us to these things. And there are studies that show that these don't really have an effect. And then there's counter studies or other studies which purport to show that these do have an effect. But the point that I'm making here is that in the real world, right, when a person starts to feel like violence is their only answer, they don't really have people they can easily turn to. Not always. You think they do. You think you can call 911 or you can call this. Well, I'll tell you about calling 911, right? So one time when I was feeling super depressed after a breakup in a relationship, I called 911. And I said, I was feeling suicidal. And I said, and then they asked me, they said, do you have anything around you that you can harm yourself with? And I was like, yeah, everything in my shop pretty much, But anyway, what happened is the police came, they took me into custody, and they threw me into a jail cell. They threw me into a jail cell naked. Naked. I think I had underwear on maybe, or shorts, I don't know. But cold, jail cell. No blanket, nothing. Obviously, they want to protect me from committing suicide while I'm in the jail. But what happened is that I sat there with no one talking to me. No one. For something like 6 hours before a counselor showed up. And me and the counselor, we spoke for about 5 or 10 minutes. I told her that the feeling had subsided, that I felt like I was okay, and then they let me go. But for 6 hours, I was cold and angry and upset and even more violent, even more down on the world, And here's the thing. I knew what I had to say to the counselor to get out of there. I knew what I had to say to not be committed to an institution for a couple days in order to be able to be allowed to leave. But what if? What if that was just an act? What if that experience had resolved me to go from not only hurting myself, but also to hurt other people and take them down? Now I'm not upset at my personal situation enough to want to cause myself harm or take myself out of the world. Now I'm upset at the system that didn't help me when I cried out for help, and instead treated me like a criminal, threw me into a hole, and let me fend for myself for hours with my troubled state of mind. Now imagine for a moment what it would have been, what the difference would have been if a police officer, for example, had just talked to me. Just hang out with me for a little bit and say, dude, what's going on? Not a psychologist, not anybody, just care, right? Maybe they don't have a therapist or a counselor there at the moment to talk to me, a professional. But at the very least, they could have been trained in how to just talk human to human. And that would have given them also information about what they would have been able to tell the counselor when the counselor finally showed up. But it would have helped me to get into a better state of mind. It would have helped me to understand that what was happening to me was certainly absolutely for my protection, because they don't know how far gone my mind is at that point, how serious I am about committing suicide. But more importantly, it would have preserved the human connection. You know? It would have made me feel like that society, the system, cared about me at that moment. And I don't mean cared about me in terms of not wanting someone to kill themselves on their watch, right? Just as a matter of less paperwork. I mean genuine human care. Where you're like, dude, what's going on? You know? What's the reasoning for this? Why are you feeling so down on yourself? And just allowing me to talk it out, you know, to talk with someone who shows some interest and some empathy would have calmed me down, would have helped me to get into a better state, into a more contemplative state, you know, even a meditation kind of state, to where I could sit back and kind of start reflecting and start thinking about, you know, the deeper issues. But that didn't happen. What happened was they threw me into a cell, literally, treated me like a criminal. I banged on the door. I was mad and angry until you know, I was exhausted. And it was a horrible experience. Horrible. So this is my point to you guys, is that we have twin pillars of concern here, right? We have fierce independent streaks within us that come down from our ancestors who took it upon themselves to risk everything, literally risk everything. If they lost, you know, there wasn't forgiveness going to, the British were brutal. The British soldiers, the British army, they were brutal people. You know, they were not inclined to be merciful. So the people who went up against the British army, they knew full well what was in store for them if they lost. You know? They couldn't expect, you know, for everyone to just be friends afterward and say this is good. So here's the thing. So we have that, right? We have this fiercely independent streak that runs through our society where people say, look, guns are absolutely important and vital to our society because we have a history of standing up to oppressive governments. And that includes, if our own government becomes too oppressive, we have to be able to stand up to them. Now let's disregard whether or not that would even be militarily possible, you know, or whether or not the military would even go along with something like that. Okay, that's a whole other issue. But the point is, the thought process runs inside of us that we should be able to, we should have that ability if it ever became necessary. You know, whether we would win or not, without that ability, we're even at a bigger disadvantage against the government than we would be otherwise. So that's a very important thought, you know? That's very important, especially given, you know, even now, even given a lot of the things happening around the world, even now, you know, we can see, to put it into context right now, everyone thought that Russia was just going to roll over Ukraine. And in fact, you know, without the help from the West, the arms help, Russia probably would have rolled over Ukraine, even with what we now know is the kind of antiquated plans and the haphazardness with which they did this, and the fact that they didn't even tell their soldiers what was going on. Even with all that, the Russian army probably still would have been able to roll into Ukraine and just take them over within a week or so, you know? But the Ukrainians have been training since 2014 with NATO help when Russia annexed part of Crimea, so they were a little bit better at that. And also, they needed weapons. They needed weapons to be able to defend themselves against a much larger opponent, right? Even now, Russia could do the unthinkable. They could drop a nuke on cities or whatever and provoke a world war. So the threat is not past here. But the fact is the Ukrainians have been able to hold on and hold off Russia and actually achieve some victories because of the fact that they have the arms to defend themselves, against a much larger aggressor. So there is no doubt in my mind that this world, at least in the state that it's in, is not ready to be a completely arms-free world. So that tactic, the fact that people say we need guns to defend ourselves against invaders is extremely valid. There's no doubt. No one will ever get an argument from me on that. But that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is responsible ownership and use and care of guns because of the power to kill that those guns have. And that's where, as a society, I think that we have a duty to each other. We have a duty to each other to preserve that right to own guns, but also we have a duty to each other to make sure that as much as humanly possible, each of us is in the right state of mind to bear that responsibility responsibly. To not have that ever be the go-to to solve problems of mental anguish. So that we really can say that guns are useful tools, that's the first thing and the last thing in our mind is that guns are useful tools for self-defense and for hunting and sporting. We used to take a lot of pride in marksmen and the feats of them, of the people who were the best shooters in the world. We still do actually in some places, but we used to like really mythologize those people. Annie Oakley, who else? Buffalo Bill, all these guys, they travel around the country and they do marksmanship exhibitions and everything, and we enjoy that because we appreciate great skill. We appreciate demonstrations of great skill. So I personally am not one that wants to ban all guns. There are people on, the very extremes who want to do that, and there are very people on the other extremes who literally think 5-year-olds should be able to walk in and buy a gun and walk out and use it. Those are the very extremes, okay? But the more moderate people towards the middle, the larger middle, they want a common sense balance between the right to own guns, which is enshrined in our Constitution, and the responsibility of owning guns, which is a social issue. Because the last thing that we really want is we don't want these guns turned against our own citizens in violence. We don't want to have to be inundated every few weeks with stories of people who went out and used their guns and shot up 4, 5, 10, 27, 30 people, 50 people. And even more troubling for me is not the person who gets mad. They get into an argument and they grab a gun and they go in and they shoot up, they shoot their parents or they shoot their friends or they go into a grocery store or a mall and they shoot up people. That sort of heat of the moment type of passionate wrong decision. Even more troubling for me are the people whose issues go deeper and they fester and they plan. They plan these things. And there's warning signs, there's things that they say and they do because this is hard to conceal, these type of feelings, these type of anger issues, these type of misconceptions about what's going on in the world, these types of feelings that are engendered by being deliberately lied to about things that are happening in the world. And that happens on the left and right, right? There's people on the far left who get extremely violent, extremely troubled by the injustices they see in the world or the issues they see in the world, and they think that killing is a way to highlight that. It's a way to draw attention to it, and a way to get people to wake up, so to speak, right? And there are people on the right who believe that the government is just way too intrusive in our lives, and they should be. They have to do something about it, to highlight these atrocities that are happening. One of the things right now is this replacement theory, where some people believe that literally minorities, non-white people, are being brought into the country to replace white people, so that eventually the white people will be the minority in this country through a deliberate act of replacement. Right? Not through natural migration or attrition or commingling of the population, where non-white people and white people intermarry or interact, have relationships, they and produce children. They think that there's literally a conspiracy out there where some group or groups are working together to literally bring people in and eventually replace the white population. That's just wrong and extremely racist, but it exists. And so what troubles me more than the people who take their easy access to guns in a fit of passion and use it are the people who actually sit back and plan these things. They're so inundated and so mentally disturbed and so much in a bubble of misinformation and disinformation that they literally become fanatical about this. It becomes a mission for them, a driving mission to kill as many people as they can in order to bring attention, even more awareness and more attention to this problem that they think is happening. People, this is the problem. Whether it's Islamic terrorists that get indoctrinated into those thoughts, whether it's white supremacists who get indoctrinated into those thoughts, whether it's extreme left militants who get indoctrinated into those thoughts, that's the problem. That we as a society need to take the temperature down, get to the facts, and explain to these people, this is not what's happening. It's truly not what's happening. And give these people the opportunities, the real opportunities to talk to the other side, talk to their fellow, talk to the minorities, talk to whoever it is they need to talk to get on an even keel, to realize that there's no amount of violence that is going to solve whatever the problem is that they think is really going on. We have to have that as a balance to the easy access to weapons. We have to make weapons not as easy to access. We have to. It's just sensible to do that. But we also obviously don't want to go in heavy-handed and strip people's rights when those rights don't deserve to be stripped. We can't have that. We've got to go deeper and care about each other as a society enough to make access to mental health and access to truth, access to others, universal and without stigma. Because that's how we get to the actual facts. And that way, when a tyrannical government really does show up, we will know it. And all of us, will band together, or most of us will, to take care of that issue when it really happens, if it really happens. But in order to know that, we need to get clarity in our minds first. There you go. That's the end of my gun talk, and I don't know if it'll make a difference in anybody's mind, but that's how I feel about it. Thank you for showing up for the first edition of John's Shower Talk.